So tonight we're going for it. 18 through 23. So Paul, would you read those verses? Yeah, thanks.
For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who hold the truth in unrighteousness, because that which may be known of God is manifest in them, for God hath showed it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds, and four-footed beasts, and creeping things.
Super, thanks very much. Okay, so we can kind of split these verses into three sections, three main sections. Really this is about man's condemnation for three good reasons. God's reasons, good reasons. First one, that man has a propensity to suppress the truth, hold the truth, it says, in unrighteousness. Secondly, man ignores God's revelation. And thirdly, man perverts God's glory. They are the three bases by which he judges what we would call a pagan world. And he also states in verse 18 that judgment is even happening now. We tend to think of eschatology, which is the theological term for the end, that at the end times God will judge the living and the dead, or the quick and the dead. But in fact God is already in some sense pouring out judgment. How is that? Because as history reveals, God has allowed moral degradation to continue on until its end point, whereby societies break down, families fall apart, and people reap basically what they've sown in their lives for not heeding God's moral law, for not listening to God and to their conscience. And so that manifestation that you see in certain societies, you see as also a judgment of God. You can look back at great empires, maybe that initially started with some kind of strong moral ethic, or had drawn from the Judeo-Christian worldview, and then as time went on, they suppressed the truth, they allowed themselves to degrade morally, and those societies splintered and eventually ceased to exist. They became extinct. But what about the ultimate wrath? What is that? What is God's wrath? What is it in reality, in that future eschaton? What does it look like? And how is it as well that we can speak of a God of love, which we all know him to be personally, and yet also he is a God of wrath? The two just don't seem to add up. Certainly not when you think about it in human terms. How can somebody be at one and the same, both angry and loving? It doesn't seem to quite add up. One definition of God's wrath is his divine displeasure with sin. We call it wrath because it shares certain basic characteristics of human wrath, but because it is God's wrath, it can have none of the sinful qualities of its analogical counterpart. So it is not the same as human wrath. Okay? It's not the same as human anger. Righteous anger from a God of love. That's what it is. And that helps us as well, because we can fall into a misunderstanding concerning the type of God that God is. We have this idea of a vengeful, fist-shaking tyrant behind the clouds who just wants to fry you, who just wants to throw you into the pit of hell. That is not the God that we're referring to. That is a pagan God, I would say. It's the God of Thor and of thunder and of the Norse gods, pagan gods. And to portray him like that, well, that does him a great disservice. I would scarce say it's almost blasphemy. So, what do we mean then by wrath of God, love of God? How can we marry these two together? Well, firstly, in our minds, we may think that they're mutually exclusive, that you can only have one or the other. But of course, that we have puny minds in comparison to God. So there's our problem where we're starting from, is that if we think we can somehow come to an understanding based merely on our rationality, forget it, because God is way beyond that, isn't he? He's beyond, his ways are higher than our ways, his thoughts are higher than ours. However, somebody who's tried to articulate the love of God alongside the wrath of God is D.A. Carson, and I wondered what you made of this this comment about the love of God and the wrath of God. And it's going to undo what I believe is a misunderstanding concerning sin and sinners. You'll pick it up straight away as I read it to you. You've probably heard this this expression before, so listen out for it. How then should the love of God and the wrath of God be understood to relate to each other? One evangelical cliché has it that God hates the sin but loves the sinner. Have you heard that one? God hates the sin but loves the sinner. It is a popular cliché, and I confess I've used it myself in times past, although I wouldn't these days. There is a small element of truth in these words. God has nothing but hate for the sin, and it would be wrong to conclude that God has nothing but hate for the sinner. Can I just repeat that again, because it's a bit of a complicated sentence. God has nothing but hate for the sin, but it would be wrong to conclude that God has nothing but hate for the sinner. Okay? A difference must be maintained between God's view of sin and his view of the sinner. Nevertheless, the cliché, God hates the sin but loves the sinner, here we go, this is Carson's view, is false on the face of it and should be abandoned. Why so? 14 times in the first 50 Psalms alone, 14 times in the first 50 Psalms alone, we are told that God hates the sinner. And I always used to wonder at this as I read the Psalms. In fact, as we've gone through the Psalms on a Sunday, I've thought, oh, yes, God says he hates the sinner. And he'll make statements like his wrath is on the liar and so forth. In the Bible, the wrath of God rests both on the sin and on the sinner. You only have to go to John 3 verse 36. The wrath of God remains on the sinner. So, how can we reconcile this? Our problem in part is that in human experience, wrath and love normally abide in mutually exclusive compartments, separate from one another. Love drives wrath out, or wrath drives love out. That is the typical human understanding. No. We come closest to bringing them together, perhaps, in our responses to a wayward act by one of our children. But normally we do not think that a wrathful person is loving. So we might just touch upon it in our everyday lives as we deal with children, our own children. At times we can be angry, but we still love them, yes? So maybe this is what we're driving at as we press this further. God's wrath is not implacable blind rage. However emotional it may be, it is an entirely reasonable and willed response to offences against his holiness. But his love wells up amidst his perfections and is not generated by the loveliness of the loved. Thus there is nothing intrinsically impossible about wrath and love being directed toward the same individual or people at the same time. God in his perfections must be wrathful against his rebel image bearers, for they have offended him. God in his perfections must be loving toward his rebel image bearers, for he is that kind of God. This is the mystery, because it's almost beyond how we experience it, that God has a hatred for and a wrath against those who offend, those who are sinners, and that is to do with his nature and his holiness. But equally, he has another perfection, which is love, which drives him to what? Send the Lord Jesus Christ. Yes, so that we might have our sins forgiven, so that he might woo us into relationship with him, so that we might be saved from that judgment. You see how both, and that's why Paul in Romans says there's kindness with God, but there's also severity. I don't know whether that's the King James translation. And we have to remember as well that we're talking about the Hebrew mindset. We've said it before, they're able to hold two apparently contradictory thoughts at once. Apparently contradictory, you see. Different mindset. We are post-enlightenment thinkers. We base our thinking on rationalism, which is a world view after all. It is a world view, it is a philosophy, a way of seeing the world. It's a pair of glasses, it is. Whereas the Hebrews understood the world differently. So, there we have it, the wrath of God and the love of God. And thank God for the love of God, because otherwise we'd be in a sorry situation, wouldn't we? Yeah. But what has man done in response to this? The love that God shares. And he does share love. We call that common grace, don't we, in our theological language. We also call it natural revelation as well. Have you ever heard of that? Natural revelation as opposed to special revelation. Natural revelation is the created order around us. You know, the fact that we look out and there's a beautiful blue sky and trees, and you know, we can go further into the country and see wonderful vistas and think, yes, well, hopefully, as it urges us to contemplate on our existence, we begin to think about God, and it helps us to perhaps question the nature of our own existence and where it all came from. So that's what God has done. If you look in verse 19, it says that that which may be known of God is manifest in them. God has showed it to them. Yeah? It's a great display before man. You go to the theatre, yeah? Wonderful night out at the theatre. It's a display, isn't it? It's with actors and stage props and so forth, and yeah. Who put this together? Who was the director? Who were the actors, you see? And similarly, you look around at the world stage in the natural order, and we think there must be some intelligence behind this. It's obvious. God has showed it. But although it's obvious, although those invisible things are clearly seen, Paul says, they are clearly seen, don't doubt it. You know, you can't excuse yourself that his power and his Godhead aren't obvious. Nonetheless, verse 21, they glorified him not as God, neither were they thankful. They glorified him not as God, neither were they thankful. I was reading about Napoleon. He was on a warship and in the Mediterranean, and so this isn't a modern phenomenon, by the way. And on a starlit night, he happened to be on the decks, and he heard a group of officers mocking the idea of God, just as they mock the idea of God today. And he stopped, and in a sweeping hand, you can imagine him doing this, toward the stars, said, "Gentlemen, you must get rid of those first." Yeah. Where did they come from? You see. But despite that witness, man suppresses it. He holds it down. He doesn't really want it to go where it ought to lead you, which is being thankful and honouring the true God. This reminded me of what happened with Moses, who went up into the mountain. What did they do? They made a golden calf. They'd seen evidence of the Lord's power, but it's this problem in men's hearts. They don't like the intangible, the unseen. They want something in front of them. It's the lust of the eyes and the lust of the flesh, isn't it? So the lust of the eyes was to make a calf that was golden, you see, and precious. And then they were to carouse and, you know, enjoy ecstatic worship of this idol, feeding the lust of the eyes, feeding the lust of the flesh. Now, dare I say it, that has infected the church as well. Has it not? You go to some places and they demand a golden calf. They want their flesh to be satisfied, so they worship the worship band, or they worship the pastor. They worship the fact that they're in a mega church. You see, it's a form of idolatry, and it's a satisfying, not of the spirit, but of the flesh. It's sensual. That's what it is. Sensual. And you can go to some places where you're pumped up and you come away, yeah, I met with God today. No, did you? Did you really? Which God? The God of your own creation? The God of your own emotions? The God of this age, even? So mythology and idolatry have resulted from man's need to satisfy those lusts and to identify some power greater than themselves, but a refusal to acknowledge that the true God is the one that should be worshipped and have the power. You look down to verse 21. They glorified him not as God, neither were they thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became as fools. Yeah? Thinking that they found the truth, they have in fact fallen headlong into falsehood. Let me give you two modern examples of this. Humanism. Two kinds of humanism. Scientific humanism, which we might call naturalism, and existentialist humanism. Scientific humanism, or naturalism, starts off with the premise that all there is that can be known can only be known through science, and that we are merely molecules in motion. It's just matter and energy. And then existentialist humanism, the chief end of man is to be free. Freedom. Freedom from the shackles of religion and God. Number one, there's a flaw. If you're a naturalist, you're starting off on a flawed foundation. You're saying all there is matter and energy, and therefore discount anything that is supernatural. Is that fair? That's putting on glasses, isn't it? Again, and looking at the world only through one particular perspective. It's just molecules and atoms and energy. And that's it. Of course, that's a skewed vision. Starting on a faulty foundation. Indeed, you can also go ahead and say, well, if you're saying that science is the only way to know anything, can you prove that scientifically? It's self-contradictory. And then, in terms of freedom, we know there's a big problem with this kind of existentialist humanism, that the person who promises themselves freedom is in fact a slave to sin, a slave to their own corruption. And so they're equally as deluded. But I tell you why this interests me, because you may be sat there thinking, oh, I know this, oh, he is droning on. But I think this also infects the church. How do I say that? How do you think, well, now this is about discounting God. No, it's about influence. It's about influencing the church. Naturalism. Very suspicious of any spiritual experiences. God doesn't do that anymore. No. The gifts ceased back in the 1st century. There's no movement of the Spirit now. No, it's just nature, and we see God in nature, and that's enough for me. And I don't want any of that. I don't know the Lord in that way. I've never met the Lord in that way. The Bible says otherwise, doesn't it? Now, I'm not saying that we all should have a particular experience like St. Paul. I'm not saying that. But when somebody asks you, do you know the Lord? And they give you a quizzical look. Know the Lord? Have no understanding of any kind of union with God in a spiritual sense. That, to my mind, is worrying. And it may well have been influenced by a very naturalistic view of our nature and the world around us. And then another problem, the existentialist humanist. How's that influenced Christianity? I'll tell you how it's influenced it. Freedom. Doesn't matter if I sin. It doesn't matter if I have a habit that's wrong, that's sinful. I don't have to concern myself with overcoming sin. I'm saved. You can't bring your good works to God. They're filthy rags. So I can go away, and if I keep sinning and sinning, and I have even no conscience about that, it doesn't bother me, because I'm saved. All's well. I'll go to heaven. That is promising freedom, but being a slave. Still in slavery, not been freed from sin. The Bible is about freedom from sin, is it not? That's the message. Not freedom to sin.